Before Big Daddy, before giant haystacks, there was one man who completely dominated British wrestling. A man so hated that people genuinely bought tickets just to see him lose. A man who understood television, psychology, and crowd manipulation decades before modern wrestling promoters even knew what heat was. And arguably the most important and controversial figure British wrestling has ever produced. This is the story of Mick McManus. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the wrestling comedian. Before we get into today's video, make sure to drop it a like, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Instagram at the wrestling comedian and over on TikTok at wrestling comedian. Honestly, this is a special one for me because I'm lucky enough to say I actually met Mick McManus himself at the 2010 British Wrestlers Reunion in Kent. And when you grow up fascinated by world of sport wrestling like I was, meeting Mick McManus is like meeting wrestling royalty. Mick McManus was born William George Matthews in South London in 1920, growing up in Camberwell and later New Cross. And unlike a lot of the larger-than-life wrestling gimmicks we'd see later on, Mick's whole persona was rooted in something very real. He genuinely was a tough South London hard man. Before wrestling, he'd worked regular jobs, including in printing, and during World War II, he served in the RAF, where he taught physical training and wrestling techniques. His first professional matches actually came while stationed in Australia during the war, before properly breaking into British wrestling after returning home. Now, physically, Mick McManus didn't look like what people today imagine a top wrestling star should look like. He wasn't 6'6", he wasn't overly muscular, he didn't have movie star charisma, but what he did have was something arguably more valuable. He understood human psychology. Mick McManus became arguably the greatest heel in British wrestling history. And I don't mean heel in the modern cool bad guy wearing expensive trainers and sunglasses sense. I mean properly hated. Grannies hated him, kids hated him, entire town halls hated him, but they all paid to see him. McManus mastered the art of winding crowds up. He bent the rules constantly, complained to referees, used underhand tactics, and perfected the idea of escaping defeat at the last second. His famous cries of "not the ears, not the ears" became iconic because fans knew exactly how to react. Everything he did was calculated, and this was during a period where British wrestling was presented far more like a legitimate sporting contest under the Mount Evans rules system. So when McManus cheated, people took it seriously. This wasn't sports entertainment yet. To many viewers at home, Mick McManus genuinely was a nasty bloke. By the 1960s, wrestling had become one of the biggest things on British television. Every Saturday afternoon, millions of viewers tuned into ITV's World of Sport Wrestling before the football results, and Mick McManus became the star of the entire industry. In fact, he reportedly made more television appearances than any wrestler in British history. That's an insane statistic when you think about it. Today, wrestling fans talk about mainstream crossover stars, but in Britain during the 60s and 70s, Mick McManus was genuinely a household name. His feud with Jackie Pallo became legendary television. Pallo was flashy, charismatic and cocky. McManus was the sneering villain everybody wanted to see beaten. Together, they created one of the defining rivalries in British wrestling history. Their match, broadcast on FA Cup final day of 1963, drew a television audience of over 20 million viewers. 20 million! That's basically unimaginable today. Now, this is where the Mick McManus story becomes really interesting, because Mick wasn't just a wrestler, he was one of the most powerful men in British wrestling. While still actively wrestling, McManus became the London booker and matchmaker for Dale Martin Promotions, and later a director within Joint Promotions itself. And if you know British wrestling history, you know how important Joint Promotions was. This was effectively the organisation controlling British wrestling during its television boom years. McManus wasn't just performing anymore, he was deciding who got pushed, who got television exposure, who became a star, and who didn't. Now, naturally, this gave him a reputation. Some respected him enormously, others felt he had too much power, and depending on who you speak to in old school British wrestling, opinions on Mick McManus behind the scenes vary wildly. But what nobody disputes is this: he understood the wrestling business better than almost anyone in Britain. One thing that made McManus stand out was that he understood television before many wrestlers did. He knew subtle facial expressions mattered. He knew crowd reactions mattered. He knew slowing things down could create drama. Modern wrestling fans might watch old Mick McManus matches today and think nothing's happening, but actually loads was happening. Every complaint to the referee, every cheap shot, every sneer at the crowd, it all built emotion. And British wrestling in that era was all about audience investment. You weren't supposed to think, that move looked cool. You were supposed to think, I cannot stand this bloke. By the late 1970s, and especially from the mid-1980s, British wrestling was beginning to change. Television tastes were evolving, American wrestling was becoming flashier, and younger audiences wanted something different. McManus eventually retired from active wrestling in 1982, but unlike many wrestlers, he didn't disappear. He remained involved behind the scenes, and even involved London Weekend Television during wrestling's final years on ITV before the sport was removed from television completely in 1988. And honestly, when World of Sport Wrestling disappeared from ITV, an entire era of British popular culture disappeared with it. Now, something people don't talk about enough is Mick McManus' involvement during the late 1990s British wrestling revival attempts. One of those was with the UWA, the Ultimate Wrestling Alliance, who tried to modernise British wrestling during the Attitude Era boom. McManus appeared in authority figure and general manager style roles, and it's fascinating seeing this old school World of Sport villain adapting to a completely different wrestling landscape, because by then, wrestling had changed massively. The kayfabe heavy British style had been replaced by crash TV, entrance music, pyro, and American style characters, but even then, Mick McManus still had presence. The second he appeared, older fans recognised him instantly. And honestly, one of the coolest experiences I've ever had as a wrestling fan was meeting Mick McManus at the 2010 British Wrestlers Reunion in Kent. And what struck me was this strange feeling of, I'm meeting somebody who genuinely shaped British television history. Not just wrestling history, television history. This was a man who millions of people grew up watching every Saturday afternoon, a man who became part of British culture, and regardless of what people thought about his politics backstage or his booking influence, you cannot deny the impact. Mick McManus passed away in 2013 at the age of 93, and with his passing, it really did feel like the end of British wrestling's true golden generation, because there will never be another figure quite like Mick McManus, a wrestler who became a national celebrity purely through being hated, and a booker who helped shape an entire industry, a television villain before wrestling even fully understood television villains. And whether people loved him or hated him, everybody remembered the name Mick McManus. But I want to know your memories of Mick McManus. Did your parents or grandparents watch him? Have you gone back and watched the old World of Sport footage? And where do you rank Mick McManus amongst the greatest names in British wrestling history? Make sure you drop a comment below and let me know. And if you want more wrestling history, opinions and comedy content, you know what to do. And remember, I'll see you on the next one.